Dead Air Studios presents The Pain Chaser 1, Ambuscade, by Patrick E. Malloy, read for you by the author. This recording is released under a Creative Commons 4.0 license, so feel free to share it with your friends or enemies, but always give appropriate credit. This story is not intended for children and contains profanity, violence, and disturbing content that some people may find offensive. If you're in doubt, please turn back now, as you may find that some doors, once opened, refuse to be shut. Five. Thursday came before any of them knew it, and the 5 inspectors bound for Kettle Creek High School spent most of the morning doing paperwork in the office. As predicted, Chase Lawrence's construction crew was still on site until well after 3 o'clock that afternoon. When the inspectors finally left Chester for Kettle Creek, it was under an ominous gray sky. But at least it was a comfortable trip. There was more than enough room in the SUV. As soon as they passed the city limits, a strange hush fell over the world. Rob turned from where he sat sandwiched in the back between Anton and Annie, pressing his face against the back window. "Weird," he said.
"What is?"
Annie asked. "I don't know," he told her. "Something just doesn't feel right." "I'll tell you what it is," Steve said without turning. "There's no one here. Hasn't been a single car on the road since we got into town." "Yeah," Rob said. "I guess that's what it is." Annie looked out the window at the traffic lights, switching from red to green and back again. Hardly seemed to matter. A blind crossing guard giving signals to no one. Anton hummed tonelessly. "Do you have any idea where we're going, Steve?" he asked. "More or less," Steve admitted. "The GPS maps for this area are shoddy, but I think I can figure it out."
"This place is as creepy as my husband said it was,"
Annie was saying.
"I knew it had a grisly history, but he never mentioned anything about how desolate the place was."
"No one wants to live in a town awash in this much blood," Anton said in the playful tone of a horror movie narrator. Steve groaned from the front seat.
"What the hell happened to this place?"
she asked. "A fire," Steve answered sharply. "It was a hell of a lot more than just a fire," Anton said defensively. "A fire doesn't drive every living person out of a town." Steve shook his head. "Fine, Anton. Explain it to her, but leave out the whistles and bells. What fun is it going into a place like Kettle Creek if you don't do it right?" "We're not here to have fun. We're here to work." "Fine," Anton said, but his boyish smile betrayed his words. The story he told her was familiar to Rob, and he felt himself becoming uncomfortable again. Thankfully, he glazed over the details of the 2 bodies found in the tunnels. "Not many people left who really remember the town. It has an eerie way of keeping people away," he was saying. "It's not eerie," Steve said. "It's superstition. People scare easy. That's all there is to it." "Okay, then what about the multiple disappearances and violent crimes?" "You yourself don't seem to know too much about them," Steve grunted. "Newspapers do the same thing you are. They try to get a rise out of people. That's how they make their living." Anton crossed his arms, obviously unwilling to give up his fantasy that Kettle Creek was haunted, but Steve's insistence made Rob feel a little better.
"A fire would have been enough for me,"
Annie said. "What do you mean?" Rob asked her.
"I don't like fire. My folks were killed in one."
"Is that why you got into this line of work?" She nodded, but didn't say anything. The car fell silent. Finally, after a long moment, Anton said, "Sorry, Annie." He let his hands fall to his sides. The empty street seemed to swallow sound, the skeleton of a once living thing, feared and forgotten. The gray sky above mirrored the emptiness, pierced only by the faint round glow that marked the sun's position. But its light could barely force its way through the dense clouds. Annie wondered how often the sun touched this decomposing place. The whole landscape seemed a photograph, expressed in sepia tones, lifeless and ancient. From above, huge lazy flakes of snow began to float down, blanketing the streets and lawns in a matter of minutes. The landscape changed instantly from a dirty yellow to an all-consuming white.
"What the fuck?"
Tabby said, breaking her silence.
"Here comes the snow."
Half an hour of silence followed, in which everyone was thoroughly convinced that Steve had gotten lost, until he finally announced, We're here. They piled out of the SUV into the darkening embrace of the claustrophobic storm. The wind had started to blow forcefully, accompanied by the drone of a low whistle that seemed to come from all around them. The school stood before them, only a vague shape in the decreasing visibility. Somehow less imposing than their shared stories had made it seem. It was just a building, after all. At the front door, a man-shaped figure motioned to them, beckoning them to come inside. As they approached, Annie saw that it was Chase Lawrence, the well-muscled foreman of the restoration team. Piercing blue eyes stared out from a tanned and weather-worn but handsome face. A black skull cap covered all but a few stray clumps of his sandy blonde hair. He greeted the inspectors at the door with firm handshakes and a charming smile. "We were beginning to think you weren't going to make it." "Great. Can we go home now?" one of the men was saying. He turned on the man. "Christ, Dimitri, give the folks a minute to get settled in, would you?" The man made a nondescript noise in his throat and walked off. "You'll have to excuse my crew. It's been a long week, and we're looking forward to getting home before the storm gets any worse." "I'll bet you want to get away from this haunted old tomb and never look back, eh?" Anton asked him. Chase gave him a long, incredulous look before finally snorting with laughter. "You're serious, aren't you?" "He's fishing for interesting campfire stories," Steve said colorlessly. Chase shrugged. "Sorry, man. Scariest thing I've seen around here are the union guys." Annie giggled, and Chase allowed his hypnotic eyes to finally take notice of her. She felt her heart flutter at his glance, and reminded herself that she was happily married. "Hello, Annie," he said, allowing his wide grin another inch of growth. "How have you been?"
"I'm okay,"
she said. Tabby laid her hand on Annie's shoulder with a chuckle as she walked past into the hall beyond. Chase didn't seem to notice. "There's coffee in the main office if you want to get warmed up." He seemed to be talking to Annie directly, but the others pushed past regardless. For a moment, the two stood alone in the entryway, just smiling at one another before Chase motioned with his head and turned on his heel. Annie followed obediently, feeling a tinge of guilt for her oogling of Chase Lawrence. Chase ushered them into a wide room that would serve as the main office for the new construction. As it was, there was no furniture in the room. Only a simple wooden barrier and an open area that would soon be filled with cubicles. A Mr. Coffee sat on the floor in the corner, plugged into a faceless outlet, encircled by a handful of styrofoam cups and sugar packets swiped from one local diner or another. "Help yourselves," Chase said to them, pointing to the coffee. "I just made a fresh pot, so it shouldn't be too bad. I just need to get my guys packed up, and we'll be out of your hair in a second." Without a further word and almost unnoticeable glance in Annie's direction, he disappeared back through the door.
"Someone's got a crush,"
Tabby said with a piggy grin and a forced laugh. "Jealous?" Rob asked her.
"Hell no,"
Tabby said, hands on her hips.
"What would I have to be jealous about?"
"I don't know. Chase is an awfully pretty man," he said, sharing a boyish chuckle with Anton. "I got a little weak in the knees myself." Annie made an effort to ignore the others, busying herself with close inspection of the nearest wall.
"Shut up, Rob,"
Tabby told him. "Then don't pick on Annie," Rob retorted. "She hasn't said shit all night."
"Why so defensive over her, Rob? You got a crush too?"
Rob chuckled. "Now I know you're jealous." He grabbed his crotch and thrust his hips at her. "You looking for somebody to tame the cougar?" "Both of you shut up," Steve said, but he was looking out the window. "I don't like the looks of it out there." The snow outside had already begun to pile up on the sill, and the world without had lost all visibility. "I wonder if that thing works yet," he said, pointing to a television they had suspended from the ceiling on a metal arm. Rob, who was closest to it, reached up and pushed the power button. The set came on, but the static was all he got. "No such luck," he said. "We could ask Chase if they have a radio when he gets back," Anton offered. "Good call," Rob agreed. "You don't think we're going to get stuck out here or anything, do you?" Anton asked. "I mean, I didn't think the storm was supposed to get that bad." "I don't know," Steve said. "I guess we'll just have to wait and see." Within minutes, Chase had returned, and the inspectors could see his work crew milling around in the hallway. "Power's on in the whole building," he said. "You shouldn't have any trouble with the alarm systems." "You wouldn't happen to have an extra radio handy, would you?" Steve asked him. "No, why? Do you need one?" he asked. "We just wanted to check the weather reports. See if we're going to end up getting stuck in the snow." Chase glanced out the window. "Yeah, it looks pretty bad out there." Let me check if one of my guys has one you can borrow. Chase ducked out and reappeared a few moments later with a small portable boombox. Here you go, he said. Not that it really makes a difference. If you get stuck, you get stuck. No point bringing a thermometer to hell. He slung his own bag over his broad shoulder and offered his hand to each of them in turn. Annie, you've got my cell, so if you need to discuss anything, just give me a call.
Or if you need a good hard fuck.
Tabby hissed under her breath. If Chase had heard her, he made no indication. He simply flashed the room a wide grin and joined his men in the hall. He could hear the crew departing as Steve plugged in the little radio and began searching the airways for a local station. The small radio spewed a montage of static and garbled words before settling in on a readable broadcast.
With that heavy snowfall, there is some chance for potential tree damage and power outages as the storm makes its appearance from the southwest,
the woman on the radio was saying.
As we go further into the night, the winds will turn from a predominantly west to more northerly direction, with high winds up to 65 miles per hour. Some coastal flooding can be expected in the early morning. If you don't have any reason to go out tonight, don't. Stay tuned for this station for a complete list.
Steve snapped the radio off. This sucks, Rob said simply, a bit of the old sadness creeping back in. He wondered how much of the powder he had left in his bag. Well, what happens happens, like Chase said. We're here, and we need to get this job done, Steve told them. If we have to stay the night, then we have to.
Fucking Christ,
Tabby blurted.
You can't really expect us to stay out here all night, Steve. I say we get the hell out of here and come back later.
Steve was already shaking his head. No dice, Tabby. You know we're on a deadline. We're up against the wall as it is. This absolutely has to get done tonight. No exceptions. He didn't look particularly happy about the prospect of being stuck in the building all night himself. What do you have on your agenda this evening that's so pressing? He asked.
Nothing,
she said sulkily. Good, he said, clapping his big hands and forcing a grin. 'Cause I got loads of paperwork for you to do. The inspection went without any real problems, each of them doing their assigned chores quietly and robotically to get the job done as quickly as possible. Annie tagged along with Steve as he checked the various gas connections. Even though Annie had already learned everything that Steve was telling her, he explained everything that he did down to the smallest detail. She felt the lesson was a bit unnecessary, but thought that the order to do so had probably come down from Mr. Shaker himself. She made sure to smile and nod at all the right times, as if learning it for the first time. Steve never let a hint of superiority enter his voice, for which she was grateful. She also knew that Mr. Shaker was really giving her a second chance. Had he meant to punish her, he would have had Tabby instruct her. In one of the upstairs chem labs, Steve noticed that one of the workers had left a sizable red toolbox. I'm sure somebody's going to be missing that, he said, giving it a light kick with his boot.
Should we take it with us?
Annie asked. Nah, too heavy. I'll just make a note that it's here, and we can let Chase know about it in the morning. Steve busied himself checking the Bunsen burners, and Annie noted to herself that he looked much healthier when he was working. The man often looked so sad, and she wondered what his story was. What? He asked, noticing her staring.
Nothing,
she said, looking away, still wondering what it was that seemed to torment him. She smiled at him and hummed to herself to hide her uneasiness. Floyd? He asked.
Yeah,
she said, her smile becoming genuine. I like them, he said simply, and continued his work. Her smile slipped away. Steve was a conundrum to her, a great lumbering ghost. He hardly said anything that didn't have to do with work. Well, if she was honest, she had to admit that she'd been quiet for most of the day herself, but she was shy and anxious in groups of people. Steve didn't seem to have that problem. He just seemed unemotional, broken somehow. After they finished with their work, the 5 inspectors met back in the main office, Anton being the last to arrive. Oh, good. We all done? He asked.
We will be, as soon as you give me your notes.
Here, he said, handing her a pile of papers. What's going on, guys? Well, there's no good news, Rob said with a grimace, his arms folded across his broad chest. The radio says we're in a state of emergency. They're warning everybody to stay off the roads.
Fuck that,
Tabby spat. Anton ignored her. How bad is it? Are we really going to be stuck here? Rob shrugged. Anton walked to the window and tried to peer out. The snow had built up on the sill and covered it completely. Even after opening the pane to shake the snow loose, the visibility outside was mediocre at best. All he could perceive was white. Jesus, he whispered. Well, I guess the only way we'll know for sure is to check the SUV, Steve said and made his way towards the front entrance. Anton followed him, with the others in tow. Steve opened the door. The wind caught it, crashed it against the far wall before Steve could stop it. The stinging cold from outside crashed over them, spraying a spiraling mist of powdery snow across the tiled floor. The whistle from earlier had become a whine that Steve had to yell to be heard over. "I'll be right back," he said, then plunged into the darkness and wind and disappeared. The others squinted into the night, but could no longer see him. After what seemed like a long time, he reappeared in the doorway, kicking snow off his boots and carrying a large black garbage bag. "It's bad," he said. "The snow's knee-deep. Completely covers the tires. We're not going anywhere tonight." There was a chorus of groans in response. "I do have some blankets I put in the trunk in case things got bad," he said, handing the bag to Rob. "We can at least make ourselves comfortable. There's more in the trunk. I'll be right back." "We should set up in the teacher's lounge," Rob suggested. "It's got running water and no windows. It should stay relatively warm compared to the rest of the building."
Fuck this.
Abby cut in.
I'm not staying in this place overnight.
"Doesn't really look like you have a choice," Anton told her.
We did. We shouldn't have driven out here in the first place. At the first sign of snow, we should have turned the fuck around and gone home.
Steve shook his head, kicking more snow from his boots. "You know damn well that we needed to get this done today," he said, then disappeared back into the blinding storm.
Maybe you did. I'm just here doing meaningless paperwork. I could do this shit at home after hours.
"What the fuck does it matter?" Rob asked her.
I have a daughter at home waiting for me.
"Oh, I'm sure you really give a fuck about that,"
Fuck you, Rob.
she yelled. "No, fuck you," he said back, grinning. "Give me a fucking break. You act like it's the end of the world or something. You think the rest of us are any happier to be here than you are? Hell, Annie..." He broke off.
No, it's okay, Rob.
Annie said.
You guys really didn't need me.
He shrugged. "You have more reason to be angry than anyone else, is all I meant,"
I know.
she said.
I'm gonna go to use the phone in the office to call my husband.
She wanted an excuse to get away, and hearing Henry's voice would help chase away the anxiety she could feel building with every one of Tabby's childish outbursts. She retraced her steps back to the office, trailing her fingertips along the dark green locker banks, thinking back to her own high school days. In just a few months, these lockers would all be full of textbooks, a black and chrome master lock hanging from each handle, and these hallways would be full of yelling children. She stopped, looking in as she passed the library. This is where the fire had started all those years ago. The room was wide open now, an overlarge cathedral, out of place in the cramped building. At the time, it would have been choked with shelves and shelves of books. The fire would have eaten it all hungrily, making no distinction between pages and human flesh. She shuddered at the thought involuntarily and forced her feet to start moving again. She took a deep breath to try to steady herself. She hated dwelling on painful thoughts, but it was hard to ignore something that so desperately wanted to be heard. The screams of the dying as the heat cooked their organs and shut them down. The choked cries of the suffocating as the black smoke forced its way into their lungs and stripped them of their strength to fight. She knew those voices. She knew them well. They were always with her. She reached the office. She realized she had tears in her eyes. She was being silly, she told herself. She wiped them away on her sleeve. This was not her childhood home. She was an adult in a safe and well-constructed building. She took one more deep breath to make sure that there was no flutter in her voice and picked up the receiver to call home. Henry picked up after the first ring. "Hello?"
Hey, baby.
She exhaled, her relief palpable.
Hey, little rabbit. Where are you?
Still at the high school.
She said with a sigh.
We're stuck here for the night.
You okay?
Yeah, we'll be fine. One of the guys I work with brought a bunch of blankets and stuff. I just wanted to let you know what was going on so that you wouldn't worry.
Well, I'm gonna worry anyway.
He said.
Are you okay?
She asked him.
You have dinner and everything taken care of?
Yeah, I'm a big boy. I can take care of myself.
She smiled.
Gonna be bored as hell without you, though.
He said.
Without anything short of a miracle, I'm gonna have tomorrow off, and the cable and internet are both out.
Read a book.
She said, laughing.
Yeah, I guess. So what's it like up there?
You mean, is it a scary old cobweb-filled tomb with ghosts and ghoulies coming out of the walls?
Yeah.
He said with a laugh.
Nah, it's just a building. The ghost must have left town when everyone else did.
In all fairness, it was a much different place when I was there. It was old and falling apart.
Right.
She teased.
And I was a kid.
Right.
Okay, Miss Bravey McBrave Pants, I'm a little scaredy puss who jumps at shadows and should probably be walked away before I hurt myself.
Well, as long as you're aware of it.
She said, laughing outright now.
I just wish you'd been there to hold my little hand and change my diaper when I wet my little pants.
Okay.
She said, tears in her eyes again, but this time from laughter.
If you keep it up, I'm gonna wet mine.
Gonna miss you tonight, little rabbit,
He said in a much more serious tone.
I already do, babe.
She said with a sigh.
I wish I was home to cuddle up with you.
Well, if you were, I wouldn't have to complain about the internet being out. I could be playing with you instead.
Oh, yeah?
She said in her most seductive tone.
Yeah,
He said.
in fact, what are you wearing? I'm nibbling your ear softly.
Stop. After the roads are plowed, will you come get me tomorrow? I don't want to have to go all the way back to the office first. And if you're going to be off tomorrow, I'd rather come straight home and see you.
Of course.
He said.
Just call me when you know what's going on.
Okay, I will.
I love you, little rabbit.
I love you too, sweetheart.
Good night.
Good night.
She put the receiver down, feeling like an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders, and began to make her way back to the office. She passed Tabby in the hallway on her way back. She was on her cell phone, yelling at someone. From the sound of the conversation, it was her daughter, but Annie made a conscious effort not to listen in. Just the tone of that woman's voice was enough to put her on edge. And she was too uplifted by her conversation with Henry to be pulled back down into her anxiety. She pulled open the door to the main office to find the boys, arms loaded with pillows and blankets.
Let me give you a hand.
She said, approaching them. No need, Rob said, hiking his load across his back. The phone still working?
Mm-hmm.
She muttered, putting her hands in her pockets and following them out the door. Steve really thought ahead. He brought flashlights and a couple of board games, too, Rob said. She beamed in Steve's direction, but his surly disposition was unchanged. You okay staying here overnight? Rob asked her. She shrugged, taking her eyes off of Steve. Yeah, I know what you mean, he said. Not the most welcoming place in the world.
It's just a building,
She said for the second time. I think it's going to be interesting, Anton said, catching up with them. Now I really do wish I brought a Ouija board or something.
I wouldn't go quite that far,
She said, frowning.
I mean, why go looking for trouble?
His grin widened. I'd like to get a look in that basement. It's the only part of the building that's from the original structure.
What about you, Rob?
She asked him, noticing the distressed look on his face.
You believe in all this stuff?
No, he said. But somehow, she didn't believe him. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you like what you've heard so far, please consider supporting my Patreon. I try to do this for free, but I do have to support myself somehow. Also, physical copies of my books are available